In this video, we'll look at every person executed in the United States during the month of April. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. On April 8, 2025, Michael A. Tanzi was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison after spending more than 25 years on death row. But what exactly did he do to end up on death row? It was April 25, 2000, a warm Tuesday afternoon in Miami. Janet Acosta, a 49-year-old administrative assistant, had parked her maroon van at the peaceful Japanese gardens during her lunch break. She wasn't looking for trouble, just a quiet place to relax and read her book before heading back to work. But someone was watching her. Michael Tanzi, who was 27 at the time, was stranded in Miami, broke and desperate. He needed a ride back to Key West, and he needed money. And he was willing to do whatever it took to get both. As Janet sat in her van with the window rolled down, Michael walked up and asked her for a cigarette. It seemed like a harmless request, but he had no intention of walking away. The moment she turned to respond, he struck. A hard punch to the face stunned her, and before she could scream or fight back, he forced his way inside the van. Clutching a razor blade in one hand and Janet's wrist in the other, Michael took control of the vehicle. He sped away from the parking lot, gripping her tightly to stop her from opening the door or jumping out. What started as an ordinary lunch break had now turned into a terrifying ride with a stranger who had nothing to lose. By the time they reached Homestead, things had taken a darker turn. Michael's plan had changed, and now Janet Acosta was no longer just a hostage. At a gas station, he grabbed some rope from the van and tied her up. He shoved a towel into her mouth to silence her cries, then leaned in close and whispered a chilling threat. "If you kick or make a sound, I'll cut you from ear to ear." With her restrained and terrified, he emptied her wallet, $53 in cash, just enough to buy a pack of cigarettes and a soda. But now he had decided that money wasn't enough. In the parking lot, Michael forced Janet to perform oral sex, holding the razor blade to her throat. When her loose teeth, damaged from his earlier punch, got in the way, he shoved her back in disgust. But he still wasn't done. He kept driving south with Janet bound and gagged in the back of the van. By 5:15 p.m., they reached Tavernier, deep in the Florida Keys. Michael needed more money. Holding the razor to her once again, he demanded her ATM pin. Terrified, she gave it to him. He withdrew money, then made a stop at a hardware store, not to fix anything, but to buy duct tape and more razor blades. Whatever was coming next, it was clear he wasn't planning to let her go. By the time they reached Sugarloaf Key, the sun had started to set. The sky faded orange, but inside that van, the mood had turned pitch black. Janet was a problem now, and Michael knew it. She'd seen his face. She could identify him. Letting her go wasn't an option anymore. So he made a choice. He turned off the main road and onto Blimp Road, a quiet, remote stretch of pavement in Cudjoe Key, surrounded by thick trees and far from anyone who might hear a scream. Inside the van, Janet sat, frozen. That's when he told her she wasn't going home. She barely had time to react before he wrapped a piece of rope around her neck and pulled. She fought back, gasping, clawing, desperate to breathe. But he didn't let go. When her panicked breathing got too loud, he stopped just long enough to grab the duct tape. He covered her mouth, her nose, even her eyes. Then, with silence smothering the van, he pulled the rope tighter. Her body was shaking. Her chest heaved once, then again, and then nothing. He dragged her lifeless body into a wooded area nearby, hidden beneath brush and shadows. He left her there, thinking no one would ever find her. Then he got back in the van and drove straight to Key West, like nothing had happened. He used her money to buy food, weed, and souvenirs. He laughed with friends, walked the streets, and acted like he didn't just end a life. He planned to hit another ATM, get a hotel, and keep moving. But what he didn't know was that police were already closing in. When Janet didn't show up for work, her coworkers immediately knew something was wrong. They reported her missing, and police wasted no time. Investigators began tracking her ATM withdrawals, and they quickly found her van parked and abandoned. But instead of towing it away, they set up surveillance and waited. And 2 days later, Michael walked right into their trap. Officers watched as he casually returned to the van, unaware that eyes were on him. When they stopped him, they found ATM receipts in his pocket, the same ones tied to Janet's stolen card. And Michael? He didn't even try to deny it. He didn't run, he didn't ask why. He just sighed and said, "I know what this is about." Sitting in the back of a patrol car, he started talking. Not just a vague admission, he confessed to everything: the kidnapping, the robbery, the assault, and the murder. And it wasn't just a few words. He repeated his confession multiple times, both on audio and video, laying out each horrifying detail. Then, without hesitation, he led officers to Janet's body, still hidden where he'd left her. Alongside it were the duct tape, the rope, and every piece of evidence he tried to hide. There were no lies left to tell, no excuses to make, and no way out. After his arrest, Michael Tanzi was indicted for first-degree murder, carjacking, kidnapping, and armed robbery. At first, he pled not guilty, but as the trial neared, he changed his mind. He stood before the court and admitted everything, pleading guilty to every charge. His defense attorneys did what they could to save him from the death penalty. They brought up his troubled past, his mental health struggles, his rough childhood. But none of it mattered. The jury saw the crime for what it was: cold, calculated, and beyond forgiveness. On February 19, 2003, they returned a unanimous recommendation: death. The judge agreed, citing the overwhelming weight of the aggravating factors, the cruelty, the violence, the senselessness. In addition to the death sentence, Michael received consecutive life sentences for carjacking with a deadly weapon, kidnapping to facilitate a felony with a deadly weapon, and armed robbery with a deadly weapon. On death row, he filed appeal after appeal, arguing about his mental health, his past trauma, and his difficult childhood. But time after time, the courts rejected his claims. The evidence was overwhelming. The crime was brutal, and the sentence stood. Just days before the execution, Michael Tanzi's lawyers made one last attempt to stop his execution. They argued that, due to his obesity, his body might not respond to the process as the state intended. His legal team claimed the sedation drug used in Florida's lethal injection might not fully work. And if it didn't, he could be paralyzed but still aware, trapped inside his own body while the drugs shut down his heart. Michael would likely suffer pulmonary edema, creating a sensation of suffocation and drowning. If sedated while on his back, he will suffer from reflux and aspiration of vomit. They argued this would be a violation of the Eighth Amendment, which protects against cruel and unusual punishment. But in the end, the court wasn't persuaded, and the execution moved forward. On April 8, 2025, Michael Tanzi was strapped to a gurney inside Florida State Prison. According to prison officials, he woke up at 4:45 a.m. and had one visitor, a spiritual advisor. For his last meal, Michael requested a pork chop, bacon, corn, ice cream, and a candy bar. When asked if he had any final words, Michael spoke in a barely audible voice. He said, "I want to apologize to the family," and then recited a verse from the Bible before the drugs began flowing. Once the three-drug protocol began, his chest rose and fell for about 3 minutes, then stopped. A corrections officer shook him by the shoulders and called his name twice to check for consciousness. He did not respond. After almost 25 years on death row, Michael A. Tanzi was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. He was 48 years old. With Michael Tanzi's execution carried out, the next death row case took place just 3 days later, this time in South Carolina. But unlike Michael's, it wasn't just the crime that made headlines, it was the method used to end his life. But before we talk about his chosen method of death, we have to go back to where it all began. It started in Virginia on July 14, 2004, when Mikal, then 21, stole a pistol from his neighbor. But he didn't stop there. He also took a station wagon and a set of license plates to cover his tracks. He had a plan, and his first stop was North Carolina. The next day, in Winston-Salem, he walked into a convenience store with a can of beer. Behind the counter stood 29-year-old Christopher Jason Boggs, a store clerk just doing his job. He asked Mikal for ID. That's when Mikal pulled out the stolen pistol. Without saying a word, he aimed and shot Christopher in the face. The young man collapsed, bleeding on the floor. But Mikal wasn't done. He stepped closer, raised the gun again, and fired a second shot straight into Christopher's body, point blank, without hesitation. Surveillance footage caught what happened next. After shooting Christopher, Mikal tried to open the cash register, but he couldn't figure it out. He fumbled with it for a moment, then gave up. Instead, he robbed Christopher's lifeless body, grabbed the beer he had walked in with, and calmly walked out. Then he got in the stolen station wagon and headed south toward South Carolina. But that was only the beginning. On July 17th, just 2 days after killing Christopher, Mikal struck again, this time in downtown Columbia. He carjacked a man, swapped out the license plates, and pulled into a gas station to refuel. There, he tried to use a stolen credit card, but it didn't work. The employees noticed something was off and called the police. But before officers could arrive, Mikal ditched the stolen car and took off on foot. Within a mile from the gas station, he stumbled onto a quiet piece of farmland in Calhoun County. There, he broke into the workshop and stayed hidden inside, flipping through TV channels like he had all the time in the world. He browsed through the tools and inspected a stash of guns, completely unaware of whose property he was on. It belonged to James Edward Myers, a 56-year-old police captain. That day, James had been with his wife and 5 children, celebrating birthdays, surrounded by cake, laughter, and love, never imagining the horror that was waiting back home. When James returned home, Mikal ambushed him. He grabbed a .22 caliber rifle from the workshop and opened fire. 9 bullets, 3 hit James in the head, 1 tore through his heart. There was no chance to fight back, no time to call for help. Then Mikal poured diesel fuel over his body and set it on fire. He stole the man's police-issued truck, his shotgun, and his service rifle and drove off like nothing happened. Hours later, James's wife, Amy, who also was a law enforcement officer, went looking for her husband. What she found was the worst thing a person can see: the burned body of the man she married, lying in a pool of his own blood right in the same shed where they'd taken their wedding photos just a year before. By then, Mikal was already gone, and he had crossed the state lines into Florida. But he didn't get far. Police caught up with him in Satellite Beach, Florida, after someone complained about a reckless driver in a white pickup truck. But Satellite Police Sergeant Jeff Pearson says Mikal did not surrender without a fight. He jumped out of the car with a semi-automatic rifle. He wisely decided to throw it down and then took off running. After almost a week of violence, the manhunt ended on July 21, 2004. Mikal was extradited back to South Carolina and charged with burglary, grand larceny, and the murder of James Myers. But what followed was a legal battle that dragged on for years. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, pointing to Mikal's long record, his lack of remorse, and the brutality of his actions. And they also revealed something chilling. 6 years earlier, during a standoff with police, Mikal had sworn he would one day kill a cop. Now, they argued, he had finally followed through. Mikal's lawyers tried to argue for life in prison. They said he had a traumatic childhood, abandoned by his mother, neglected by his father, bounced from home to home. They said he'd been institutionalized as a child for suicidal behavior and grew up angry, broken, and ignored, and he had spent most of his childhood in juvenile. But the jury wasn't moved. Days later, he pled guilty. On December 8, 2006, the judge sentenced him to death. Mikal was just 23 years old at that time, Later, he was also charged in North Carolina for the murder of Christopher Boggs, for which he got life without parole. Then came the appeals. He filed one after another, claiming his lawyers failed him, that there was new evidence, or that death by execution was cruel and unusual punishment, but all were denied. And if you think the story ends there, it doesn't. Because in 2009, while sitting on death row, Mikal got involved in yet another violent plot, this time with fellow condemned inmate Quincy Allen. Together, they came up with a plan to kill a correctional officer. They lured the guard with a simple request: "Can we go to the basketball court?" But once outside, they jumped him, stabbing him again and again. The officer survived, but the scars didn't fade. The attack cost him his job, his sense of safety, and his peace of mind. As for Mikal, he lost all privileges behind bars, but his death sentence remained untouched. He stayed right where he was, on death row. Then, for over a decade, everything stalled. South Carolina couldn't get lethal injection drugs. Executions stopped. The state responded by rewriting its laws, bringing back the electric chair, and introducing a third option, the firing squad. By 2023, the courts had cleared the way. Mikal's appeals were done, and his name was on the list. On March 14, 2025, his death warrant was signed. He had until March 28th to choose between three options: lethal injection, electrocution, or firing squad. If he didn't choose, the state would do it for him. Eventually, he chose the firing squad, just like Brad Keith Sigmund on March 7, 2025. According to his lawyers, the thought of burning in the electric chair or suffocating slowly on a gurney haunted Mikal. So when the time came, he chose what he believed was the quickest way out, the least of three evils, they said. On April 11, 2025, Mikal chose a last meal of ribeye steak cooked medium, mushroom risotto, broccoli, collard greens, cheesecake, and sweet tea. Then Mikal was placed in a chair, a target pinned to his chest, and a black cap covering his head at 6:01 p.m. During a firing squad execution, the inmate is strapped into a metal chair in a room that also contains the state's electric chair, which remains in place. A hood is placed over the inmate's head, and a target is marked over their heart. 3 voluntary corrections officers stand behind a wall 15 feet away with loaded rifles. The wall has a small opening, not visible to witnesses. After the warden reads the execution order, the officers fire. Witnesses, including family members, media, and attorneys, can see the inmate's right side profile through bullet-resistant glass. Mikal gave no final statement, didn't speak, and never looked at the witnesses, including his own lawyer, who were seated just feet away. The state's firing squad protocol called for 3 prison staff to fire simultaneously, aiming at a bullseye target on Mahdi's chest. What followed was described by those in the room as both shocking and deeply disturbing. Mahdi let out a sharp yell that cut through the silence. One witness said it felt like a deep heave, as if his chest expanded hard, then collapsed. His arms flexed, and he groaned twice, about 45 seconds after the bullets hit. Witnesses reported that he continued to breathe for another 80 seconds, taking what appeared to be a final gasp before going still. A prison doctor stepped forward and pronounced him dead at 6:05 p.m., less than 4 minutes after he was shot. At 42 years old, Mikall Mahdi was dead. By the time he died, Mikal had spent 68% of his life either in juvenile or adult prison. The next execution was scheduled 12 days later, this time in Texas. Let's take a look. On April 23, 2025, after spending more than 20 years on death row, Moises Mendoza was executed by lethal injection in Texas. But before we discuss his final moments, let's go back to where it all began. For most people, the story begins on March 18, 2004, when a quiet morning in Farmersville, Texas, turned into a nightmare. A young mother wasn't answering her door. Her home looked ransacked, like someone had been desperate to find something or someone. And in the bedroom, her 5-month-old baby was found crying, alone, on a bed that had been turned upside down. The woman's name was Rachelle Tollison. She was just 20 years old, and she was gone. But to understand what really happened, we need to go back. Back to the night before, March 17. That day, Rachelle had visited her mother's house, then returned home with her baby around 10 p.m. It was a normal evening. But sometime between that moment and sunrise, everything changed. The next morning, Rachelle's mom came by to check in, like she always did. But this time, the back door was wide open and the house was in chaos. The bed had been shoved out of place, the headboard knocked loose like someone had fallen into it, and a nightstand was pushed away from the wall. But the weird thing was that Rachelle's purse was still sitting there, and her car was untouched. On the kitchen floor, her divorce papers were lying face down, smudged with a large, muddy boot print. And baby Avery, who was just 5 months old, was lying on the mattress alone. But Rachelle was nowhere in sight. When police arrived, they knew right away something bad had happened. This wasn't someone who packed up and left, and within hours, a full search was underway. Dozens of neighbors, on foot, on ATVs, even on horseback, searched the fields and roads around Farmersville. They kept looking for 5 days straight, but they found nothing. Then, about 10 miles outside of town, a man hiking through the woods saw something in the dirt. It looked like the site of a fire. He got closer and saw the burned remains of a young woman. Later, investigators confirmed the truth. It was Rachelle. Her body had been dumped in the middle of nowhere, set on fire, and buried under a pile of logs. It quickly became clear what the killer had tried to do: erase everything. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing left behind. At first, detectives focused on Andrew, her estranged husband. The divorce had been messy, and it was Rachelle who had filed it. But Andrew told them he'd been at a party the night she disappeared. He said that he drank too much, got a ride home, and never left his house after that. His alibi seemed solid. People at the party remembered he'd been there and remembered how drunk he was. But there was one detail that wouldn't go away. There had been a bonfire at that party. And the wood used to burn Rachelle's body? It looked a lot like the mesquite wood from that same fire. All the logs were tested, 8 from the crime scene and 3 from the bonfire Rachelle had been to on the night of her death. Every single one had the same strange chemical signature, the same mix of metals, the same weird amount of titanium. This meant the logs came from the same area, maybe even from the same tree. It was a breakthrough. For the first time in forensic science, burned wood had become a piece of hard evidence. At first, that pointed suspicion straight at Andrew again. He was at the party. He had access to the fire. But when detectives started digging, witnesses stepped forward. They told the police something new. Andrew didn't bring the firewood. Another man did. A 21-year-old named Moises Mendoza. Witnesses told the police that Rachelle and Moises knew each other from high school. After her separation from Andrew, Moises had shown interest in Rachelle, and they had spoken briefly at the bonfire, but Rachelle had told friends she wasn't interested in him. When officers first questioned him, he didn't deny knowing Rachelle. In fact, he admitted picking her up that night, claiming she had left with him willingly. But that would mean she chose to abandon her infant daughter alone in a ransacked house, something no one believed. But then the story got darker. The next time he was questioned, Moises said that while they were in his truck, he choked her until she passed out. He then took her to a field behind his house, where he sexually assaulted her, choked her again, and dragged her deeper into the field. That's where he strangled her for a third time, this time until she stopped moving. And to make sure she really was dead, he stabbed her in the throat. At first, he left her body where it was, thinking no one would find it. But as police closed in, panic set in, and suddenly he knew he had to hide the evidence before it was too late. So he loaded her into his car and drove deep into rural Collin County, pulling off onto a remote dirt pit far from any road or home. There, in the quiet of nowhere, he set her on fire. When the flames died down, he buried what was left beneath a brush pile, thinking no one would ever find her. But 6 days later, they did. Investigators had started looking into Moises's past, and what they uncovered set off alarm bells. He had a history. Just months earlier, he'd tried to abduct multiple women in Dallas. And at the time Rachelle vanished, he was already out on bail. When they searched his house, things got worse. They found a pair of boots in his room, caked with soot and soaked in the stench of gasoline. Crime scene investigators compared the tread to the boot print left on Rachelle's divorce papers, and a forensic analyst examined the wear patterns and scuffs along the heel. It was a perfect match. Then they found the jeans. They were buried beneath ash and grime, but hidden in the fabric were tiny flecks of dried blood. They sent it off for testing, and when the results came back, there was no doubt. It was Rachelle's blood. The case was building fast. Physical evidence, DNA, the matching boot print. But when they confronted Moises, he didn't react. No denial, no apology, no emotion at all. He sat there cold and quiet, like none of it had anything to do with him. Moises was arrested and charged with capital murder. And when it came time for trial, it wasn't about whether he did it, since he had already confessed, but it was about whether he'd be sentenced to death. And it didn't take long before the jury decided on his fate. On July 1, 2005, Texas law required the jury to answer two key questions. Was Moises a future danger to society? And were there any reasons he should be spared? They said yes to the first and no to the second. Moises began his life on death row, launching a legal battle that would stretch for years. His lawyers argued that his defense team failed him, that they didn't dig deep enough into his past, that they missed signs of mental illness, trauma, or anything that might have changed the jury's mind. But all his appeals were denied, first in Texas, then at the federal level. The sentence stood. On April 23, 2025, after spending over 2 decades on death row, Moises was finally executed. He wasn't allowed to choose a last meal. Texas removed that option in 2011 after 2 inmates ordered a massive feast and refused to eat it. Now they received the same food as everyone else. After he was strapped to the gurney, his spiritual advisor prayed over him for about 2 minutes. Then Moises turned to the victim's family. One by one, he addressed them by name. Rachelle's parents, her 2 brothers, her cousin, and her uncle, all watching through a window from the adjoining room. "I am sorry for having robbed you of Rachelle's life," he said. He also said he had robbed Rachelle's daughter of her mother, adding, "I'm sorry for that. I know nothing I could ever say or do would ever make up for it. I want you to know that I am sincere. I apologize." Her daughter wasn't present, but his words were directed to her anyway. Then, turning toward another window, he spoke in Spanish to his wife, sister, and 2 friends who sat watching. "I love you, I am with you, I am well and at peace," he said. "You know that I'm well, and everything is love." At 6:21 p.m., the drugs began to flow. Moises let out 2 loud gasps, then began to snore. After about 10 snores, his body fell still. He was pronounced dead at 6:40 p.m. At 41 years old, Moises Mendoza was dead. And that brings us to the final execution of April 2025. Just 1 day later, James Osgood was executed by lethal injection after spending more than a decade on death row. But to understand how James ended up on death row in the first place, we need to go back to October 2010, when everything started. It was the morning of October 13, 2010, when Tracy Brown didn't show up for work. That wasn't like her, not even close. Her employer called, texted, and waited, but nothing. It was the silence that made him call for a welfare check. And when Tracy's landlord unlocked the door to her mobile home, he found something no one ever wants to see. Officer David Moses with the Chilton County Sheriff's Department was one of the first on scene. He stepped into the bedroom and froze. Tracy's body was lying on the floor, naked, right next to her bed. Her back was slashed with stab wounds, and her throat had been cut so deeply that he didn't need a coroner to know this wasn't an accident. This was a killing. Lieutenant Shane Lockhart quickly took over as lead investigator, and it didn't take long for him to realize this wasn't something one person could have done alone. The crime scene was too violent, too chaotic. As Shane dug into Tracy's final hours, a pattern began to form. He learned that the day before she was found, Tracy had spent time with two people, her cousin, Tanya Van Dyke, and her boyfriend, James Osgood. Shane brought James in for questioning. At first, the story sounded normal. James said he and Tanya had been running errands with Tracy, cashing a check, paying bills, even looking at a car she was thinking about buying. Several witnesses backed that up and everything seemed fine. But then Shane asked James if there had ever been anything sexual between him and Tracy. James hesitated, denying it at first, but then he shifted. He admitted that the three of them, James, Tanya, and Tracy, had sex that day. He said it started with oral sex, then escalated. James told the detective that he and Tanya agreed to lie about it afterward because Tanya and Tracy were cousins. Tanya felt ashamed. But shame wasn't the only thing James was hiding. There was more, and it was much, much darker. A gun had been found in the trailer, and when asked, James admitted they brought it. He claimed it was for protection. Tracy had been worried about a neighbor who had been bothering her. But Shane noticed something else too. A fresh cut on James's pinky finger. That kind of injury, Shane said, was common in stabbing cases. Once a knife gets slippery with blood, it's easy to lose grip. James denied everything, but the officer wasn't buying it. He placed him under arrest and got search warrants for James's house and vehicle. A month later, James, now locked up in the Chilton County Jail, asked staff about his car and phone. When Shane got wind of this, he decided to pay him a visit, this time with Captain Eric Smitherman. But what James didn't know was that a woman named Tiffany Matthews, who was sharing a cell with Tanya, had given detectives a written statement. In it, Tiffany said Tanya confessed to the killing. She gave graphic details only someone involved could know, and Lieutenant Shane brought that statement to the jail. He changed the pronouns, made it sound like Tanya herself had written it. Then he read it to James. James listened, then asked him to read it again. After a long pause, James lowered his head, then he looked up. "You might want to get a pen and a piece of paper," he said. And then came the confession. He said it started with a fantasy, one he shared with Tanya. They had both watched crime shows. James remembered a CSI episode about two brothers torturing a victim. That stuck with him. He'd had thoughts like that for as long as he could remember. And eventually, he and Tanya began talking about making it real. They wanted to find someone, maybe a child molester, maybe just someone random at a store. But instead, they chose someone they already knew: Tracy. James said the plan started when the three returned to Tracy's home after their errands. It began with Tanya slapping Tracy in the hallway. That was the signal. James grabbed her from behind and put her in a chokehold. Once she was weak, they dragged her to the bedroom. What happened next is hard to repeat. James forced Tracy to perform oral sex while Tanya pointed a gun at her. Later, he told Tanya to shoot her if she resisted. At one point, Tracy asked to use the bathroom. James followed her in, and when they came back, Tanya ordered her cousin to perform oral sex again, but this time on her. Then it got worse. James admitted to having sex with Tracy while Tanya watched. Tracy tried to escape, but James caught her by the hair and dragged her back inside. He said that's when they decided it was time. He pulled out a knife hidden in his sock and slashed her neck, aiming for the jugular. But it didn't work. Tracy was still alive and fighting. James got scared and panicked. He stabbed her in the back and then kept cutting her throat. He told detectives he apologized to her as she bled out. She was tortured for almost an hour before she was finally killed. "It's nothing against you," he said. "Just stop fighting. Let go." When it was over, James took a shower in her bathroom before returning home, where he and Tanya got intimate once again. James was charged with 2 counts of capital murder, one for committing the murder during a rape, the other for killing her during an act of sodomy. The jury didn't hesitate. On June 13, 2014, they found him guilty and voted unanimously for the death penalty. Later, an appeals court ruled there had been a problem with the jury instructions during sentencing, and a new hearing was scheduled. But this time, James made a request no one expected. He asked to be sent back to death row. When the judge asked why, James said he believed in an eye for an eye. He said he deserved to die. In 2018, that request was granted, and Tracy's family supported the decision. After spending more than a decade on death row, James Osgood's time officially ran out on March 6, 2025, when the Alabama Supreme Court signed his final death warrant. There were no more appeals, no more delays. His execution date was set in stone. On Thursday, April 24, 2025, his final day came. In the days leading up to his execution, James had met with more than 20 people. On Wednesday, he saw a dozen visitors and spoke with 7 more by phone. The next day, hours before his death, he met with 11 people, including his daughter, his sister, other family members, friends, and his attorney. He ate breakfast and snacks, but refused lunch. For his final meal, he requested pizza. At 6:09 p.m., the curtain to the execution viewing room opened. James was already strapped to the gurney. At 6:11, he spoke his final words. For over 10 years, he had avoided saying her name, out of guilt, out of shame. He felt he didn't have the right to, but he now felt disrespectful not to name her. In his last moments, he said it aloud for the first time in all these years. "I have not said her name since that day. Tracy, I apologize." Then he turned to the people watching, his loved ones, and offered them quiet gestures. At 6:12, he sat upright and made hand signs, 143, code for "I love you." At 6:15, he laid his head down. He took slow, deep breaths as the drugs entered his system. And just moments later, a guard performed the routine consciousness check, calling his name, pinching his arm, flicking his eyelid. James did not respond. By 6:18, his breathing stopped, and at 6:35 p.m., James Osgood was pronounced dead. He was 55 years old. That concludes all executions carried out in April 2025. Which case shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below.